Alright, here is the room that we're going to put the crown molding in. It's a pretty large office space off the back of my new shop. Just so you can get an idea of the dimensions, it's a rectangular space 12 foot by 20. There's 3 doors and a couple of windows. And up here in one corner I had the electrician pre-run wiring for some low voltage LEDs to run all the way around the perimeter of the room. Now ordinarily if I was doing crown molding with no lights, it would just go right up against the ceiling and the wall like this. But because there's got to be space for the lights, the crown molding has to be down from the ceiling just a little bit, kind of like this. Incidentally, this is not the crown molding I'm using, just a test piece I milled up. So normal crown molding is attached at the top and the bottom. So once we lower it, it's no longer going to be secured to the ceiling, and the single attachment point to the wall isn't really going to be enough to keep this properly adhered. So I need to make a triangular shaped bracket that I can screw to the wall so I have something to nail the crown molding to. Then I need to make another triangular shaped wedge to attach to the crown molding so I have something I can stick the LED strip lights to. The wood I'm going to use for the triangular bracket was entirely salvaged from the construction debris that came from building the shop. I've been moving this pile around for a few months now. These are the actual pieces that I pulled out of that pile to use for this project. So basically what I'm doing is making a little right triangle where the 2 equal sized legs are going to be exactly 1 3/8 inches long. I suppose what I could have done is just use some of the 2x4s and 2x6s out of that pile and cut the triangles directly from that, but I decided I'd rather make this more difficult. Also, by making a little bracket the way I'm showing, it's going to be lighter and that'll be easier for a single person to install. I could have done it like this and that would have worked perfectly fine for my purposes, but I'm trying to make an instructional video, and if you're using wider crown molding, you're definitely not going to want to have a solid bracket. So what I'm making and what you'd want to do for wider crown molding is something like this. And having that flat channel in the middle will also make it easier to screw to the wall. Anyway, after I milled the boards to 1/2 inch thick, I used the router table to add a 45-degree chamfer to the edge of each board. I needed to make 64 feet of angle brackets, so I repeated this step many times. After I routed off that 45-degree edge, I ripped off 1 3/8. This piece will account for one side of the triangle. After cutting 64 feet worth, I changed the width on the table saw to 7/8 of an inch and proceeded to do the exact same thing over and over again. These pieces will make up the other side of the triangle, and the reason they're only being cut at 7/8 is because in addition to the 1/2 inch thick pieces that they're going to be attached to, that will make them the requisite 1 3/8. And yeah, about 64 feet worth. Lastly, I moved the rip fence to 1/2 inch and repeated the same process, except this time these pieces are going to be used for the actual lights to attach to. More on that later. After cutting out all the pieces, I started assembling my triangular brackets. I used glue and 23 gauge pin nails. This part of the process went pretty fast, and when I was done I had about 64 feet of triangular brackets. Before I started to install the brackets, there was one thing I had to account for, and that was the business end of the mini split for the HVAC. The crown needed to be low enough that the electrician would still be able to get the lights in there, but it couldn't be so low that it would bump into the mini split. I settled on having the crown 1.5 inches below the ceiling, which gave enough room to still get fingers in there to be able to stick on the LED strips. This meant the bottom of my crown needed to be 3 3/4 inches below the ceiling. I compared that measurement to the actual crown molding that I'm going to be using, and with my triangular bracket, I determined that the bracket itself was going to have to be 2 inches below the ceiling to get that 1.5 inch spacing on the crown. I cut a 2-inch wide strip of scrap wood to be able to make a line perfectly parallel to the ceiling. Then I realized trying to see that line with the bracket in the way so close to the ceiling was going to be pretty difficult. I cut another piece at 3 3/8 inches, which is where the bottom of that triangle comes out. I used this piece to mark a line all the way around the perimeter of the room. Next I went through with a stud detector to figure out where my screws would go. With all the stud locations marked out, I was finally ready to start cutting the pieces and attaching them to the wall. The way I'm cutting these is probably not necessary, but I like to try and keep everything in my brain oriented from the top down, so I wanted the triangular pieces to be held on the saw from the top down to cut, and it's pretty easy to be able to do that safely. I just used some double-sided tape to attach some scrap pieces of the triangular brackets right up next to the fence, and that will form a cradle that will hold my pieces while I'm cutting them, so everything will be nice and secure and nobody loses any fingers. So like I said, this isn't really necessary. I could have changed the compound angle on the saw and cut it that way, or I could have cut from the bottom to make these properly oriented, but I just found it a lot easier to do it like this. I still used that 2-inch wide piece to space the bracket perfectly even from the ceiling, but drawing that other line on wasn't a waste of time because it showed me exactly where I would make my stud marks. So I screwed the triangular shaped bracket on using trim screws, and I think they were about 2 inches long. A 2-inch long finish nail would have worked fine for this as well. Basically, the only thing this bracket needs to do is to be able to support the weight of the crown molding itself and nothing more. So I probably used more screws than I strictly needed to. Whenever I got to a corner situation like this, I cut the 45 and then just eyeballed where the 90 would go. Anyway, while this goes, I'm going to talk a little bit about what's coming next. I'm using solid wood finger jointed and pre-primed crown molding. They don't sell this at the big box stores around me where all they have is MDF. I don't really like doing anything in MDF if I can help it, and I had to have this special ordered from a lumberyard. They gave me 4 16-foot lengths of crown molding, which is exactly what I need, so I have zero room for error when it comes to cutting it. Luckily, because this crown molding is going to be painted and not stained, I don't have to be too perfect in the corners. That being said, any gap bigger than maybe a 1/16 of an inch is going to be pretty hard to hide and look like crap. I'm going to use this jig to make my cuts. I bought it about 5 years ago, and it gives you a good 95% solution to the problem. Out of curiosity, I took a quick look on Amazon and saw there's still plenty of options available that are very similar to the jig I have, and as you can see, they're not all that expensive. The most similar version to mine is only about $21. Real quick, when cutting crown molding, it's important to remember that the narrow is always the top and the wide is always the length of the wall. That's also the bottom. So here's how jigs like this work. There's only inside corners in my room, so I set the miter saw to 45 degrees and then I put the jig on the inside of that corner. If I were doing an outside corner like this one, I would put the jig on the 135 degree side. The top of the crown molding, whichever side you choose, is the side that goes on the top of the jig. Make sure your fingers are out of the way and the jig's out of the way, and then you make your cut. Some people might have an opinion over what is the top and the bottom on the crown molding. To me, this big flat part here should be the top. At least that's how I prefer it to look. But the fact is, it'll install the exact same way with this small cove at the top as this big flat part. So really, it comes down to whatever your personal preference is. So anyway, what I just cut would have been the left side of a corner, and to do the right side, you just flip everything around to the other direction. Aside from showing how this jig works, I'm also cutting one sacrificial corner that I can install and make it easier to get my first piece of crown molding lined up. I screwed this into the first corner, so I have something to jam the cut piece of crown molding against while I'm installing it. Next, I measured the distance of the wall, and you have to do this up at the top because walls in houses are never straight, so you need to get the most accurate measurement possible. Also, it really helps to tape the tape measure to the wall so it doesn't fall down while you're trying to get your measurement. And never assume that one side of the room is going to have the exact same measurement as the opposite side. Crown molding typically comes in 16-foot lengths, so it really pays to have a lot of space when you're cutting this. First, I cut a miter on one corner. Then on the back side of the crown molding, on the wide bottom part, I mark out the measurement that I had just gotten from the wall earlier. Remember, this is the bottom part of the crown molding, so it has to be the longest length. Assuming you're working in a room with only interior corners like mine, when you cut this properly, you're going to end up with a shape like a trapezoid. This straight line right here represents the absolute longest this piece could be and where it would butt up against the wall if there wasn't a miter. The white primed edge that I'm putting the small line on just there is where the crown molding actually contacts the wall, and that line represents exactly where the cut line needs to be. That angle line is just there for visual representation and was no way accurate, although it ended up being pretty darn close. It's easy to see these lines from the top of the saw when you're actually operating it, but I put the camera behind so I'd be able to capture it on film. It can be hard to get the saw lined up perfectly on the first cut, so I tend to creep up to my cut line like this. Remember, my actual cut line is the one on the little primed face at the bottom of the frame and not that angled cut going over the unprimed face. After I made these cuts, I went and held the piece up to the wall, and as it turns out, it's slightly short, but I'll show how to fix that later. Really quick, I'm going to show you how an actual craftsman would do this and not a home DIYer like myself. If this wasn't going to be painted, I wouldn't be able to rely on caulk to hide any mistakes or inconsistencies, so I would have to cope out the profile. I'm not really good at this, though I think with a little bit of practice it wouldn't be that hard to do, but I really just included this in the video so you could get an idea of what's involved. I spent about 15 minutes doing this badly just for the purpose of showing it in this video. Properly done, this looks great, but it takes too much time in my opinion, and for paint it doesn't matter.
Ain't nobody got time for that!
Before I can attach the crown molding to the wall, I still need to glue on the piece that the LED strip lights are going to be attached to. My electrician's going to be the one to install the LEDs, but here you can see how they'll actually attach to the crown molding. I want the LEDs themselves to face the wall so that it's not shining out into anyone's eyes and creates a nice soft diffused glow. This is where it pays to have a lot of clamps. An additional benefit of adding this strip to the back of the crown molding is it makes it more rigid and easier to install. On some of the shorter pieces I did just attach it with pin nails, but on anything longer than 4 feet, putting it on with glue and letting it dry is really the way to go. So this is embarrassing, but I realized now that the glue is dry that I glued these to the wrong side. The strip should have been up here. So now I gotta fix that. So, take 2. Remember that the LED light strip needs to be glued on the narrow portion of the crown molding. Once that glue had dried for the second time, I was able to install the piece. Having that little sacrificial piece installed on the left there, as well as that part for the LED strip lights that I was able to sort of balance onto the triangular bracket, made putting this up pretty easy. Also, I'm using 18 gauge brad nails that I think were about 1.75 inches long. Using the brad nails makes it easier to fill all the holes later, and because they're going directly into the solid wood of that triangular bracket, I don't think I needed anything bigger than what I used. Since the long side of the wall is 20 feet and the longest piece of crown molding I have is 16, I only had to put an angle on one side. Again, I glued on the piece for my LED strip lights. Now if you can, find somebody to help you do this, because trying to put up a 16-foot long piece of crown molding by yourself is not easy. But if you are by yourself, I've got a method to make it work a little bit better. Throw together a little bracket that you can attach to the wall that has some kind of lip on it that is wide enough the crown molding can sit in. I used 3 brad nails to temporarily attach this thing to the wall. Now it's not on the wall super securely, but that means it'll be easy to remove, and right now it's in the perfect position and up just high enough to be able to hold that crown molding in place and let me get it started. I also don't like to use anything bigger than the brad nails to hold that bracket onto the wall because they leave small holes that are easy to fix. For something that's going to be painted, a corner that looks like this is pretty good. Now for the small piece that finishes up that wall, I cut the next corner, and then on the back, like before, I measured the length that I needed to run, but this time instead of doing an angled cut, I was able to just do a simple straight one. I did still glue on the LED strip, but I also just pin nailed it on and went ahead and installed it, and the reason I didn't wait for the glue to dry this time is because this piece isn't long enough to flex and bend around as much as those big pieces were. From there, the work just kind of proceeded all the way around the room. So I'm up to my final piece, and I have a slight mistake in this corner that I figured out a way to fix. I'm going to show that now. So when I put this last piece in place, there's kind of a big gap right here, and the reason is this piece, the very first piece I cut, was just a hair too short. And this piece here is the perfect length, but because this piece... Clearly I didn't properly position the camera, so I'm just going to skip ahead to the next part. So right here, this shim I added because this piece was cut slightly too short, and that was the first piece I put up. So by adding this shim, I can bring the piece that's going to go right here out just a little bit, and it will tighten up this gap to the point where with a little bit of filler, I'll never be able to see it. I'll show you how that corner came out later, but right now I want to point out that butt joints like what's going on right here are really important to get lined up exactly right per the contours of the crown molding, because if they're not, by the time this is all done, it's going to be pretty obvious. So to make that butt joint disappear, I like to use a lightweight automotive body filler. I mixed a small amount up. Then I used one of my leftover anodized black aluminum business cards from laser testing videos to apply it. I ended up doing this twice per joint. I scraped the Bondo on pretty carefully and tried to make sure I followed the contours of the crown molding. After it cured, I sanded and reapplied another thin coat, and then after that cured, I sanded it again. I sanded with 120 grit sandpaper wrapped around various objects to help match the contours of the crown molding. After everything was sanded and it looked good, I added some primer to cover all the bare wood. All the nail holes were filled using white plastic wood filler. The 18 gauge brads are so small that the holes really aren't too large, and I'm able to fill them with this wood filler and then just scrape it smooth with my finger and not have to go back and sand. Walls, even in new construction, are never perfectly straight. So you sometimes get little gaps like that where the wall undulates just a little bit underneath the molding. And that's what caulk is for. I used the caulk for the corners of the crown molding and the gap between the wall and the crown itself. This is that same corner that I did that little trick with the shim on. You can see now with the caulk, by the time paint's on there, you'll never know that there was a gap. After the caulk had dried, I did do a second pass to get any spots where it had shrunk and pulled away while drying. Next up I painted, and this is where I regretted using that gray primer because those areas required 4 coats of paint to fully cover up, where everything else was good with just 2. And a tip on the painting, I always paint the crown molding white first and then do the color on the wall because it's way easier to cut in from the bottom than the top. Please excuse the quality of these pictures because they were taken in low light, but both of them show those butt joints that I used the body filler to cover up, and you can't even tell those joints are there. When the electrician's schedule allowed, he came back and installed the LEDs along with these 2 drivers that went on the other side of the wall from where those wires came out. And here on the other side, which has now been painted, you can see how it all looks. Because the LEDs are facing the wall, we have a nice diffused glow that gives a good ambient amount of light. Personally, I love it, and I can't wait to be able to work out of this space. Anyway, I hope you found this video enjoyable or at least useful, and if you made it this far, as always, thanks for watching.